Hello, everyone. Today, I want to talk about the war in Vietnam, and I want to specifically tackle two of the questions that usually come up in class. One of them is who won the war, and the second one is a follow-up, right? So once I explain the war in Vietnam was won by the Vietnamese, the question is always, how did we lose that war, right? If we were the biggest nation in the world, the most powerful nation coming out of World War II, how did we lose the war, right? So that's what I want to talk about today. So let's get started. All right. So to answer the question of why did the US lose the war in Vietnam, I think the easiest way to understand this is to compare it to the American Revolution, right? The circumstances are quite similar. Okay. The colonies are, a group of people who were supposed to lose the war. We don't have a lot of resources. We don't have a lot of, means to win the war, and we're fighting the biggest, mightiest empire of the world at the time, who are the British. Yet somehow we get to win it, right? Very similarly, in the war in Vietnam, the Vietnamese are not supposed to win this war. Uh, America is the biggest, most important, most powerful nation in the world. Yet the Vietnamese also won it, right? So drawing these parallels between the revolution and the war in Vietnam helps you understand how it happened, right? So, very similarly to the American Revolution, what happens in the war in Vietnam is that the Vietnamese win the war very similarly to what we did, right? They won it by not losing it, right? So that is the very important strategy that Washington used to win the American Revolution. Winning by not losing, meaning you don't need to win every single battle. You don't need to win, decisively in the battlefield. You just need to make the war long, gritty, unpopular, right? The longer the war drags out, the more the more unpopular it's going to become over time, and the more likely it is that the biggest nation is going to lose it, right? And that is exactly what happened in both of the wars, right? So, uh, the very famous quote of the Vietnamese saying, "The Americans have the watches, but we have the time." That is actually what happens here. All right, the Vietnamese are willing to drag this war, make it greedy, make it a war of attrition, make it as long as possible, and it's gonna force the Americans into a war that they're not prepared to, right? So that is what's gonna happen here, right? So there are other very significant parallels. That's the first one, and I believe is the most important one to understand it. The other one is that they have support, right? Also very much like the American Revolution, just like we had support from the French and eventually from the Spanish and the Netherlands, also the Vietnamese are going to have help from the Soviets and the Chinese. I believe that the Soviets were actually financing about $1 billion per year to help the Vietnamese win. Same thing, right? In the American Revolution, without the French support, we cannot win this war. In the Vietnamese War, the North Vietnamese are unable to win the war without the support of the Soviets and the Chinese. Right. So these are the two most important parallels that you're going to see, guys. But there are other very important parallels, which I like to connect it not to the American Revolution, but rather to World War II, right? And that is the local support. Okay, so World War I is the war that you're gonna see the most support from Americans. All right, almost everyone was on board with the war. World War II was considered to be this righteous war, right? Everyone was on board, and I mean the people, the government, industries, everyone involved in the war. We had this concentrated effort in which we all had a role to play, right? We all had a role to play, whether you were young, whether you were older, whether you were a man, whether you were a woman, a corporation, whatever your part in society was, you played a role into supporting the war, right? And I think one of the important statistics to consider here is that by the end of World War II, about 400,000 people died, Americans died in the war, yet we still very fully supported the war, right? However, in the war in Vietnam, it is about 58, 60,000 American lives that are lost, which is about 10, 15% of the casualties compared to World War II. However, the support in the war, it is not the same. The war in Vietnam seemed more obscure, or I don't know if obscure is the word, but it's more ambiguous. People don't know whether we should be there or not. Only about 35% of the people supported the war. Uh, Not everyone is really on board with it. So you see this comparison, and I think it's very important to understand is one of the other reasons that we lost the war. Well, while in World War II we had a lot of big support from everyone, in the war in Vietnam, not only is the people not on board, but eventually the media is going to play a very important role. Also, let's not forget there's another very important statistic to consider here, and is that during World War II, about 12 million Americans served in the war, right? When you compare this to the 35% approval rate the war in Vietnam had at the time, you're gonna see this difference between the support at home is gonna be very significant, right? Because when the war becomes longer than it should have been or than we expected it to be, the more people become more, unsupportive of the war. We in America kind of are the ones who forced the Americans to leave Vietnam, right? Because the war at home was becoming increasingly unpopular. And in all of this, the media played a very significant role, right? Whereas in World War II, the media was incredibly supportive of the war. There was a lot of censorship, kind of sort of in the idea of not showing certain images. Sometimes Americans were not very aware of the things that were going on that were could have been controversial. Like for example, the bombing of Dresden, which is kind of like a dark spot on the Americans during World War II. There wasn't a lot of media coverage of the Japanese internment camps at home. So in a lot of ways, World War II had a lot of support from the media. In contrast, with the War of Vietnam, the media played a very important role to make the war unpopular. Okay, and it had two distinct effects, right? One of them was making the war unpopular because what you were seeing was images. For the first time in history, you could actually watch the war live, right? When in World War II you would see reels that the news presented to you, and it was very curated to show you exactly what the government wanted you to see. In the war in Vietnam, you were watching the war live, and you were watching horrible things, right? The My Lai massacre, you saw the Tet offensive, you saw, the very famous Napalm Girl picture, all the different things that people back at home are horrified by, all right? And it makes you question, like, what are we even doing in Vietnam? And why is this so horrible? Why are so many American lives being lost in this? Why are we fighting this war again? So a lot of people are kind of like becoming increasingly unsupportive, right? Because what you're seeing live is brutality, the horrors of war. And this is the first time in American history that we see this, right? So the war becomes increasingly and increasingly unpopular, right? Even the American public starts to turn against the American military. So, in a way, it's very tragic that a lot of these young soldiers thought that they were going to be received at home or perceived at home the same way that American soldiers were received or perceived in World War II. But that was not the case. The soldiers back in Vietnam were perceived by the American public as the bad guys, right? So it's a crazy scenario that your own people see you as the bad guys. They don't want this, right? So this is I think the number one most important outcome of it with the media coverage. And the other one was this increasing distrust in the American government, right? Because while Lyndon Johnson is, in front of the cameras and telling people that the war is very close to be over and that it's not so bad, and in a lot of ways lying to the people, you with your own eyes are seeing what is happening, right? So LBJ and the American government may be telling you some things and telling you to disregard all the different things and the war's about to be over and it's gonna be soon. And at the same time, you see the Tet offensive, right? At the same time, you see the brutality. At the same time, you're seeing that this war is not about to be over like they're claiming it's going to be. This war is longer than everyone's expecting, and it's horrible. Why are the American people out there, right? And one more time, why are we even fighting this war? So this other very important point is the American distrust in the American government, right? And so the media plays this very important role in questioning the governments in ways that it hadn't done it before, right? So the government is going to inevitably lose the support of the people, its credibility with the people in the war in Vietnam, okay? Because at the end of the day, you know, the war becomes very morally ambiguous, right? Why are we even there? Okay, when you see this horrible statistics of about 4 million civilian casualties and a lot of the atrocities that had happened at the time, okay, and we can see those effects on TV. You know, people are beginning to question, like, are we really the good guys? Like, are we, like, why are we doing this again, like, to stop the spread of communism? Like, it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So the war is going to irreparably damage the credibility of the government with the American people, right? And the media plays a very important role in all of this, right? So when you put it all together, right, the strategy of winning without losing, the support of the role of the media, the picture becomes more clear as to why the Americans lose the war in Vietnam. Okay, and you know, the other thing that I think it's worth mentioning is that when you compare casualties, you know, in terms of military, uh, I believe it's about 1 million Vietnamese people that, you know, that die, and you know, another, you know, couple million people that are wounded. And when you compare it to the 58,000 people that perished, Americans, during the war, when you see the statistics, sometimes people, like for example, my students ask me like, but you know, how did we lose the war, right? And it's important to mention, you know, killing more people doesn't mean that you won the war, right? At the end of the day, we pulled out of Vietnam during this Vietnamization in the 70s, and you know, Vietnam became a communist country, right? So at the end of the day, they ended up doing whatever they wanted to do. So there was nothing we can do to stop it, right? Even with this incredible amount of casualties. So,
And
anyways, this is my explanation as to how do we lose the war of Vietnam. And I'm oversimplifying a lot of things. There's a lot of things going on with this. But in a long story short kind of way, this is how, you know, the biggest, most important nation of the world ends up losing a war that no one thought it was supposed to lose. But once you put everything into context, it kind of makes sense that we actually lost the war in Vietnam, right? And again, it's going to have an incredible outcome here in the US, right? Not only, you know, with the American public, but the American government losing its credibility with the Americans. It's also the beginning of the rise of the new left and a lot of very different aspects that, you know, kind of like created uh, this new left in the 1960s, 1970s in the US in a lot of ways is a result of the war in Vietnam. And so, anyways, this is all I have for you all today. Let me know what you think. Was the war in Vietnam an unwinnable war? In a lot of ways, once you put everything together, it kind of seems like an unwinnable war, but let me know what you think. I'll be around and be safe, okay? See you guys.